Hello. Today I'll be talking to you about land claims in the Yukon-BC borderlands. And before I start with my presentation today, I'd like to take a chance to take the opportunity to acknowledge that I'm living in Williams Lake, the traditional territory and unceded territory of the Secwepemc, the Tsilhqot'in, and the Southern Dakel. So I just wanted to take a moment to kind of acknowledge that and kind of reflect on what exactly that means in terms of our obligations towards the Indigenous peoples and from whose homeland we're presenting today. And so turning our focus a little ways further north from where I'm currently living, I'll be talking, kind of talking about land claims in the Yukon-BC borderland and kind of how the imposition of a colonial border affected the negotiation of land claims and kind of the efforts for Indigenous peoples to have their rights recognized on each side of the border. So throughout much of the 20th century, the Yukon-British Columbian border influenced the lives of Indigenous communities who had previously hunted and trapped on both sides of the boundary. In the 1970s and 1980s, as land claims negotiations commenced in the Yukon and BC, the border took on new significance. During 1973, significant steps towards the negotiation of land claims occurred on both sides of the border. On January 31st, 1973, the Calder decision had pushed the federal government towards the recognition of Aboriginal title, and eventually, at a much slower pace, the BC government as well. Two weeks later, the federal government agreed to negotiate land claims with the Yukon Native Brotherhood, who were negotiating land claims on the part of the Indigenous peoples in the Yukon. And this decision was in response to the Yukon Native Brotherhood's their submission of their land claims brief to the federal government, entitled "Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow," which you can see there. There was also there were also political developments that were occurring on both sides of the border, which shaped exactly how these land claims proceeded. As a territory, the Yukon government had not possessed the same degree of constitutionally enshrined powers as British Columbia. However, as land claims commenced, the territory's settler population sought to achieve, was also seeking to achieve responsible government, as well as the devolution of powers from the federal to the territorial government. And a number of Yukon politicians even wished to see the territory achieve provincehood at some point in the not so distant future. As a territory, the Yukon government did not initially hold a seat at the land claims negotiations table. However, after putting up a fight, they were eventually able to gain a seat at the table. As a province, the British Columbia government was required to have a seat at the negotiating table. However, their reluctance to acknowledge Aboriginal titles had slowed the negotiations process, and further affecting the land claim negotiations in northern British Columbia. The provincial government had come to see the northern part of the province as a source of hydroelectric development and a source of electricity for the south. And so in the late 1970s and early 1980s, BC Hydro had devised a number of plans for hydroelectric developments on the Stikine and the Liard rivers. The threats that these developments had posed to Aboriginal rights and title had prompted the formation of Indigenous organizations to try to push for the negotiation of land claims, such as the Cascadena Council. My paper will examine how the BC-Yukon border had influenced land claims in the Yukon and in northern BC. It's an examination that will include a consideration of the political realities on each side of the border, and how the border influenced the land claims processes of Indigenous communities whose traditional territories were bifurcated by the dividing line. In order to keep the topic of transboundary claims manageable, my analysis will focus on the 1980s. However, this is an issue that has persisted well into the 21st century as well, and there continues to be developments along these lines. And so this is just kind of a small snapshot in terms of the kind of the broader history of transboundary land claims. The traditional territories of many First Nations was divided by the Yukon-BC border, which was established along the 60th parallel. It was an arbitrary line that cut across natural barriers as well as natural travel corridors. More importantly, for the purposes of this paper, it cut across the traditional territories of numerous First Nations, including the Kaska, whose traditional territory I have up on the screen, as well as the Teslin Tlingit and the Carcross Tagish First Nation, as well as a number of other First Nations who resided in both the northern BC and in the southern Yukon. Sorry. As the First Nations began negotiating their land claim agreements, the issue of transboundary claims emerged as a central issue. Initially, when land claims negotiations commenced between the federal government and the Yukon Native Brotherhood, the Yukon's Indigenous population negotiated their land claims as a unit. This situation continued into the 1980s, and under the Yukon Native Brotherhood's successor organization, the Council for Yukon Indians. However, even as the negotiations were going on, there were First Nations in the southern Yukon who had land claims that extended into northern BC. Additionally, there were First Nations in northern BC, such as the Tahltan and the Kaska, who had land claims that extended north into the Yukon. Finally, some Indigenous groups, such as the Kaska, had communities on both sides of the border. The Kaska and the Yukon being the Ross River Dana and the Liard First Nation, were at the time represented by the Council for Yukon Indians. Meanwhile, the Kaska and BC were in turn represented by the Kaska Dana Council. As First Nations entered into land claims negotiations on both sides of the border, government policies had raised concerns that these overlapping claims would not be recognized. For example, in 1981, the federal government had released a land claims paper entitled land claims policy paper. Entitled "In All Fairness." In addition to rationalizing their previous lack of progress on land claims due to its, and quoting here, confusing and bewildering nature, the policy also stipulated that Indigenous peoples living in one land claim or under one land claim agreement couldn't benefit, were unable to benefit from another settlement. And so this raised concerns about some First Nations who might need to have two land claims agreements, one with the Yukon government and the federal government, and one with the BC government and the federal government. And the policy also stated where the natives use land lying on more than just one jurisdiction, and in the event that this cannot be continued through mutual agreement among the competing parties, compensation must be paid or specific wildlife harvesting rights be granted, subject to the general public laws existing within the area of dispute. This policy had threatened to reduce Aboriginal rights Aboriginal rights to use the region that was traditionally used to hunt and trap, to being the equivalent of a resident settler based on this imposed colonial boundary. This policy prompted a response for Indigenous peoples who saw their transboundary rights threatened. In June of 1983, the Council for Yukon Indians and the Kaska Dana Council released a joint paper that was critiquing the federal government's policy that would prevent these cross-border land claims. The paper drew attention to the many transboundary claims which traverse the borders of the Yukon-BC and the Northwest Territories. 1 second here. And so here we can see an excerpt from this critique of the federal policy, where it identifies a number of the overlapping claims, both in BC as well as in the Northwest Territories. And this doesn't even capture all of the transboundary claims that were happening in the 1980s. And so this critique and describing the potential implications of the federal government's policies, the brief read that these groups will be disenfranchised from the opportunity of participating in the settlement of lands upon which they have legal and historical claim. The Council for Yukon Indians and the Cascadena Council concluded the brief by recommending an exemption to the policy for Indigenous peoples with historic claims and overlapping political boundaries. Indigenous efforts to have their transboundary rights recognized was not necessarily a simple matter of debating policy. In the early 1980s, Sam Johnson, the chief of the Teslin Indian Band, now the Teslin Tlingit Council, had sought clarification about the band's hunting and trapping rights from the provincial authorities in British Columbia. And on January 21st of 1982, DJ Robinson, the director for BC's for the BC government's Ministry of the Environment, the Fish and Wildlife Branch, had written to Johnson and noted that in 1949, the BC government had approved the band's application for a trap line in the province, even though its members were no longer residents of the province. And so, well, he had felt that the BC government needed to honor this past recognition, but he did require the band to follow certain procedures, which you can see the procedures on this slide here that I'm currently showing. And so Robinson felt that the matter of hunting was a much more challenging problem, in contrast to trapping. The Teslin Tlingit had requested permission to hunt for a certain quota of game, game for food while trapping. As Robinson noted, the trapping season of October 31st to May 15th had coincided with a period in which the hunting of most game was not prohibited, and he didn't want to set a precedent for allowing this kind of activity. There was some further clarification of the Teslin Tlingit's hunting rights in BC that was provided by John Munro, the Minister of Indian Affairs of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, in a letter to Jim Fulton, the MP for the Skeena district, who was corresponding with Munro about the issue of Teslin Tlingit hunting rights in British Columbia. Munro kind of laid out some of the requirements for around Teslin Tlingit hunting rights in northern BC, and basically. In this quote you can see here, the Teslin Tlingit would be considered individual residents of BC during the trapping season, therefore would be allowed to hunt. So based on Munro's letter, it appears that there was some type of movement on the part of the BC government concerning Teslin Tlingit trapping rights in British Columbia. The Teslin Tlingit's second request entailed permission to hunt big game during open season for food. And Robinson replied, "Since you're are presently non-residents of the province, I am unable to issue a sustenance permit, as to do so would be contrary to the intent of the regulation, which is to provide sustenance at a time of real need, not provision of a food supply for other times of year." Moreover, Robinson had concluded that the only way that the members of the Teslin Indian man could legally hunt in BC was to purchase non-resident hunting licenses, as well as the appropriate special licenses for the species they intended on hunting. So the BC government's position had effectively reduced the Teslin Tlingit's Aboriginal right to hunt in BC to that of a non-resident Canadian citizen. The researching of land claims was also impacted by the border. As First Nations applied for federal funds in order to research their land claims, the BC-Yukon border influenced their abilities to obtain funds. As the Council of Yukon Indian land claim negotiations advanced, Indigenous communities in BC who had claims in the southern Yukon had sought to demonstrate their own Aboriginal rights and title in the Yukon. These communities included, of course, the Cascadena Council, as well as the Tahltan, as well as the Atlan Indian Band, now known as the Taku River Tlingit First Nation. However, the abilities to acquire funding in order to research these transboundary claims appears to have been contingent on the location of contemporary communities within a respective First Nation and the federal government's views as to whether these rights were under threat. For example, the Cascadena Council wished to acquire funds in order to research the land claims in both British Columbia and the Yukon. On October 22nd of 1981, Monroe had written to Peter Stone, the chairman for the Cascadena Council, regarding funding for research and negotiating land claims. In his explanation as to why the Cascadena Council would not be receiving funds to research land claims in the Yukon, Monroe had written the following, where he basically had stated that while there was concern regarding the Cascadena and the Tahltan overlap in the Yukon, the federal government had determined that this would be resolved through the discussions with the Council for Yukon Indians, who represented the Cascadena in the Yukon Territory. So whereas there were no Tahltan communities in the Yukon, and so therefore the Tahltan were able to access funds to research their land claims in the Yukon, because there were Cascadena communities in the Yukon who were under the umbrella of the Council for Yukon Indians. The Cascadena Council, representing the BC Casca, were unable to achieve these funds to research their transboundary claims. So as the Cascadena Council began researching their land claims, focusing on British Columbia, they realized that they could not fully examine Cascadena land use in BC without also considering land use in the Yukon. In 1983, the federal government had approved Cascadena Council funding in order to conduct land use and occupancy research. The research commenced in 1984, conducted by anthropologist Peter Douglas Elias. In my personal communications with Elias, he states that the federal government was quite clear that the study was to focus on BC only. However, as Elias began working with the community, it became clear that focusing solely on British Columbia would not work. As he wrote to me, we immediately found out that none of the people we mapped could or would separate BC from the Yukon. And so we just went ahead and did the mapping wherever the person's narrative took us. Whenever federal representatives had arrived in Lower Post in order to examine the process of research, the research team removed the Yukon-related materials from the walls and moved those files into Elias's shack. After the federal government eventually learned that they were mapping the land use both in the Yukon as well as BC, they had threatened to withhold the final payment for the work. The situation was eventually smoothed over by the lawyers, and as a result, the Cascadena Council produced two reports. There was one report that focused on land use in British Columbia, and the other that focused on land use in the Yukon. While the Cascadena Council were advancing their transboundary claims, the Atlan Indian Band, or the Taku River Tlingit, had also sought to have their own rights and title recognized in the Yukon. According to notes that were taken by Fulton during a phone call with Peter Fisher, a senior negotiator for the Office of Native Claims, there were a number of concerns that expressed that the recognition of the Council for Yukon Indians rights and the settlement of their land claims could potentially result in the extinguishment of the Taku River Tlingit's rights, which wasn't the intent of the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development at the time. However, correspondence between Fulton and Monroe indicates that in addition to their overlapping land claims in the Yukon, the Taka River Tlingit also had overlapping land claims with the Tahltan in both the Yukon and BC. It was the federal government's hope that the First Nations would work out the overlapping land claims themselves. However, the federal government was also prepared to appoint fact finders and mediators if necessary to resolve the issues around overlapping claims, which had been done in the Northwest Territories before. And so while, according to Fulton's phone conversation with Fisher, there was not the department's intention to extinguish the transboundary claims through the settlement of the Council for Yukon Indians land claims, this continued to be an issue in 1987. At a meeting of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, Michael Smith, the chairman for the Council for Yukon Indians, had stated that once there's a land claim in the Yukon, the rights of the non-resident groups would also be extinguished. And Smith also commented on the portrayal of these overlapping land claims as, and I'm quoting here, people who have come to raid and pillage the farms, but the rights that they have, the rights that they want to protect are the rights they are now exercising. And so as the federal government sought to resolve the overlapping land claims between the different First Nations, they participated in an exercise of territoriality. This process has been described by anthropologist Paul Natesty in his description of land claim agreements in the Yukon under the umbrella final agreement. Land claims, according to Natesty, transform traditional territories into administrative units. Moreover, the boundaries that resulted from these land claim agreements weakened the kinship ties and reciprocity that traversed these traditional territories. Colonial borders such as the Yukon-BC border imposed an additional element of territoriality. These borders created administrative differences with respect to Indigenous land rights, in which these rights might be reduced to that of an out-of-province hunter, to use one example. These intranational borders further demarcated and controlled the territories from which Indigenous peoples in this northern region had long derived their livelihoods, further reinforcing the added dimension of territoriality and that colonial borders contributed to land claims. When John Perry, the NDP MP for the Kenora Rainy River riding, had raised the question of transboundary claims in the House of Commons Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development on February 19th of 1987, he stated, I would like to turn to the matter of overlapping claims, which are the sort of thing that scare the hell out of people in government because of the difficulty that the Euro-Canadian culture has in understanding that concept. We do not relate too well to the land until we can put a fence around it. Thank you.